mai kako. O wau o Tuti Baker, he Hawai'i, au mai kailua a me Waimanalo mai au. Greetings to everyone. I am Tuti Baker from Kailua and Waimanalo, a Kanaka Maoli with ancestral ties to Hawaii Island and Kauai in the Hawaiian archipelago. And I'm currently a guest on the land of the Lactamush and Nooksack peoples on the Salish Sea in the town that settler colonials named Bellingham and what is known as Washington State. I want to welcome everyone to Learning and Living in Solidarity, a conversation with Hawaii, sponsored by the Global Development section of ISA. In this conversation, we bring together scholar activists who work across multiple lines of struggle in Hawaii and beyond, and who also find common ground to work together. Through this conversation, the Solidarity Committee of GDS, consisting of Isaac Kamola, Olivia Rutadzibwa, Sherry Polanski, Rohan Kalyan, Ekta Kaushal, and myself, hope to develop a deeper understanding of how solidarity comes into being, how it can and does infuse our activism, how it can and does change our scholarship. It's our hope to build an archive of solidarity, the experiences of and commitment to life, to living, to survival, to resilience, and to love, to futurities and worldings that sit outside and beyond those imagined by colonialism and capitalism. Solidarity begins with proper relations. A relationship to place where we are, our responsibilities as individuals to diverse collectives. And we could change the slide, next slide. Pacific Islanders and Indigenous communities across the globe mediate these questions through protocols and ceremonies that reinforce relationships and responsibilities. The photos on screen are examples of two such protocols. The first is a pofiri that Maori educator Dr. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith talks about in a public lecture she gave celebrating the 15th anniversary of the publication of Decolonizing Methodologies. This pofiri, she tells us, was an opportunity for her iwi, her relations, to shift the center, to change perspectives. The pofiri is about moving people through a series of protocols that then join people together. Another protocol prevalent in Kanaka Maoli gatherings are circles. The circle in this photo is an aloha circle that begins the working day at Ho'olu'aina. This photo is a community work day where a diverse group of people have come together to work in the gardens and forests of Kalihi, where Ho'olu'aina is situated. They begin by standing shoulder to shoulder, and like the pofiri, the energy of the group coalesces in the center. So I would like us all to take a moment to ground yourself in place, to acknowledge the elemental forms, the ancestors, and all existence of the place where you are. And from our separate groundings, let's join together in a virtual circle to listen to and interact with Candace Fujikane, Noelani Goodyear-Kaopua, Cynthia Franklin, Kajihiro, each of whom will reflect on their work as scholar activists. And in addition to their engagement in community transformation, all of our speakers today teach at the University of Hawaii. Candace Fujikane is a professor in the English department. She just published Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, Kanaka Maoli and Critical Settler Cartographies in Hawaii. She also co-edited Asian Settler Colonialism from Governance to Habits of Everyday Life in Hawaii. Noelani Goodyear-Kaopua is a Kanaka Maoli educator, writer, and activist who's driven by a lifelong commitment to Aloha Aina. She is a professor of Native Hawaiian and Indigenous politics, teaching in the political science department. She's a stalwart kia'i, or protector of Kanaka Maoli lifeways and wahipana, documenting, analyzing, and proliferating the ways people are transforming imperial and settler colonial relations through Indigenous political values and initiatives. Cynthia Franklin is a professor of English and co-editor of biography. Her current book project, The Human in Crisis, Narrating Public Lives and Movement Politics in the Contemporary U.S., draws upon her solidarity work in struggles for freedom in Palestine as a white anti Zionist American and in Hawaii as a settler ally. She's on the organizing collective for the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel and a co founding member of Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine at UH. Kyle Kajihiro is a lecturer in ethnic studies and geography and environment. He recently earned his MA and PhD in geography, and since 1996, he has been involved in research, organizing, and actions related to environmental justice, Kanaka Uivi sovereignty, countering negative military impacts in Hawaii, and forging solidarity with international peace and social justice groups and social movements. So that's as we begin, get ready to as we begin our conversation, our reflections. I want to ask the audience to feel free to put your thoughts and questions in the chat, and when we each speaker is finished with their initial reflections, we'll hopefully have time for discussion and question and answers. And so now it's a great pleasure for me to pass the talking stick on to Candace Fujikane.
Thank you so much, Tuti, for those introductions. And I really want to thank all the organizers, Tuti, Rohan, Sherry, Isaac, Olivia, and Ekta, for putting together this really wonderful panel. And I'm so happy to be here with the people that I respect the most and I love the most. All of the people on this panel are amazing. And so my name is Candace Fujikani, and I'm speaking to you from Kanaka Maoli lands in He'ea'uli on the island of Oahu. I'm an English professor at the University of Hawaii, where I've been teaching for 26 years. I teach courses on Hawaii literatures, Asian American literatures, and cartography. And My political awakening started at UC Berkeley, where I went to graduate school. And I've been a part of the movements, Kanaka Maoli movements for sovereignty and independence for the last 20 years. And I stand with Kanaka Maoli to protect lands and waters, including that of Mauna Kea. And many of you will be familiar with the international um, solidarity that emerged from that movement to protect the Mauna and its waters. I've stood for Mauna Kea for the last 10 years. I got involved in 2011. Um, and in my book, Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, Kanaka Maoli and Critical Settler Cartographies in Hawaii, I talk about the importance of the movement from being settler allies to being settler aloha aina. And This is something that I've thought about for a really long time. Terminology is always complicated. And there have been many critiques about the use of the term ally as a kind of almost like a press badge or a kind of a way to claim authority, a way to claim some kind of uh, legitimacy. And so I do think the word ally is important, and and many people in Hawaii continue and use the term. They don't always use the term settler, but I use the term settler to call attention to the ongoing processes of settler colonialism in Hawaii, as well as occupation. I would say the political situation in Hawaii is the U.S. occupation of Hawaii, and that the cultural and social processes are settler colonialism. But the movement from ally to aloha aina signals a commitment to not just to people, although that is very important, but also to the land itself. So as a settler aloha aina, which is a term Noelani Goodyear-Kaopua talks about in her book, The Seeds We Planted, in that term, what I see is both a commitment to protecting lands and waters for future generations, and also an affirmation of Hawaiian independence. And those two things are very important. And also, I think another thing that I explain in the book that's not always clear is that being a settler aloha aina takes on international dimensions when we think about the ways that it also means an opposition to all forms of oppression, which includes Islamophobia or anti Black racism or discrimination against trans peoples, queer peoples, non binary identifying peoples, the poor, women. And there's and I do I'm hoping that we could talk a little bit more about the international context for the murders of the 7 Asian women in Atlanta, which has really, I think, rocked so many, the country, in so many different ways. But this international dimension to this solidarity, I think the initial impetus for this panel discussion was that Cynthia Franklin, who has done an incredible work at introducing a lot of the issues that Palestinians are facing in the occupied territories to students and faculty at the University of Hawaii, that she organized us to read one of Leila Khalid's pieces, one of her personal essays, because the University of Hawaii had censored her and had not allowed her to speak at the, I think it was the ISA conference. But that kind of censorship is something that we all have a kuleana, we all have a responsibility to oppose. And I also have written, and because of my relationship with Cindy Franklin, I've written an article on the ways that Japanese Americans or um, have been used by the Israeli settler state to yellow wash and rebrand um, Israel. So they circulate the figure of
انضربت ما سمعش فيها والله بالفيديو تاعي طافيه.
um, so they circulated the figure of Senator Daniel Inouye, a Japanese American war veteran, to show that he supported Israel. Now, Daniel Inouye is known for having fought in World War II, and he lost his arm in combat, and so. But he was held up by and a military installation, a defense missile site, was named after Daniel Inouye in Israel. And so that kind of international circulation of a political figure in order to rebrand Israel is something that I wanted to call attention to, because Daniel Inouye has had a very prominent role in obstructing Kanaka Maoli's struggles for independence and sovereignty. And so we can see that settler states rely on each other, but in the same way, we have liberatory solidarities against these settler state um, uh, sort of, interconnecting hegemonies. Yeah. So that's part of the work that I do. And that's the kind of global arena for our work as Settler Aloha Aina. And some of the other prompts and questions had to do with how does solidarity come into being? And for me, solidarity is an embodied practice. Um, it's um, it's a doubled practice. I talk about being a settler aloha aina as a doubled praxis. We work on the one hand within the settler state against the settler state, challenging its laws, holding it accountable to its own laws, because the settler state is always breaking its own laws. And on another level, we're always working for a future beyond the settler state, beyond the carceral state, beyond the racial state. And I'm really looking at a decolonial future and an abolitionist future. And so those are the doubled movements that are really important. So as an academic, I do a lot of research. I draw on my skills as someone who can read and write against the settler state because I'm familiar with its logics. So I testify in land use, in arenas where land use is discussed. The Land Use Commission, the Board of Land and Natural Resources, the state legislature, the Commission on Water Resources Management. I stand in those spaces to protect lands and waters. Um, Now, I'm sorry. Am I at times? Can someone let me know? And I have like a minute left because I don't want to go over my time, and I can talk forever. Okay, so let me know the 1 minute mark. Okay, just hold up a one, and I'll stop. Okay.
Okay, okay, I will.
Okay. So so that means that the part about working against the settler state, that is very important. That is about standing in toxic spaces. These places are, you're hearing the settler state argue what it thinks are its best arguments, and they're incredibly illogical. And so you have to stand there listening to them discredit Kanaka Maoli elders, the kupuna. You have to listen to all of these things, and you have to formulate arguments. You almost have to figure out how to say the same thing 100 different ways so that they will keep listening to you, because they cannot hear after a certain point. So I testify in those toxic spaces. And when I see Kanaka Maoli getting arrested for protecting lands, I'm not glorifying arrests, but I do think that there's something terribly wrong when a Kanaka Maoli activist is getting arrested 3 or 4 times. So I've been arrested at Kalailoa after talking to an auntie who had gotten arrested 3 times, and I told her, "Don't get arrested tonight. I'll stand in for you." Yeah, so that is holding space. What holding space means is someone like me, where being arrested does not affect me very much. But for her third arrest, the consequences are always increased exponentially. The other part about working for a future beyond the settler state involves working at community work days, at Lo'ikalo, the restoration of these ancient taro pond fields, the restoration of waterways, the owai, the restoration of lokoi'a, the fish ponds, the restoration of traditional knowledges. So I have, as part of my scholarship, taken 6 years of Olelo Hawai'i so that I can look at texts in Olelo Hawai'i to understand a worldview that is not dictated by a settler state or a Western perspective of the world. Okay, so that is my just an opening for all of us to enter into an understanding of global solidarities and also local movements for solidarity. Oh, and so the next speaker is it Noelani? I can't remember. Yes,
Yes.
Noelani Goodyear-Kaopua, very dear friend. And she has, I always learn so much from her, very inspired by her work.
Aloha kākou, o Noelani Goodyear-Kaopua ko uinoa no o Ahualua mai au. Nā aina kamahao o kalihilihi o Laumiha a me he eia I hanai mai ia'u. Mahalo nui to the organizers for inviting me. It's so wonderful to see you folks. Thank you so much, Candace, for leading that off. And just to let you know kind of where I am speaking from today, I am in the Ahupua of Waikiki, which many people know around the world for sort of Waikiki Beach, that Waikiki Beach view. I'm just about a 10-minute drive away from there, but Waikiki is an Ahupua. It's a land division that is historically considered to be an aina momona of fat and abundant land that once contained many fishing, very abundant fishing grounds and lo'ikalo and lots of water, which is embedded in the name. And so that's where I am speaking from right now. Waikiki is currently inundated by spring break tourists. But we won't get into that so much. I wanted to kind of open this introduction of myself by first saying how much I've learned about solidarity from my hoaloha who are on this panel along with me, starting sort of in order of when I met them in my life. First of all, from Kajihiro, whom I met when I was an undergraduate, and we were both supporting the Pai Ohana in Kona, who was trying to not get evicted from their ancestral homelands by the US National Park Service. And he helped me to kind of embed the analysis of what was happening there in a larger work of solidarity that he had done prior to returning to Hawaii and learned about the Center for Third World Organizing from him and other things. But especially the way that his geopolitical tours over the years, along with his partner and one of, I would say, a mentor of mine, as well as perhaps his Auntie Terry Kiko'olani, really modeled for me what it means to do critical education that is place-based. And also from him, I've really learned about how important it is to care for the friendships and the partnerships, that one has, in the ways that he has cared for that friendship with Auntie Terry, who is now an elder. And then from Candace, first encountering her work when I was a grad student and being intrigued by her article, Local Nation in grad school, and then seeing the ways that she was able to take the feedback from Kumuhonani Kea Trask in such a graceful way. I'm sure it was difficult at the time and was fairly early in her career, but was able to take that in a way to really open this expansive conversation about Asian settler colonialism, and then to model for us what it means to live as a settler aloha aina / ally / accomplice in such profound ways through her dedication, more than a decade's worth of work in support of the struggle to protect Mauna Kea in all different kinds of ways. And then Cindy, who I didn't meet until I was hired at UH, but whom I have come to know as a fierce and fearless advocate for students, for human rights, for real academic freedom, for justice for Palestine and Palestinians, as well as Kanaka Maoli. And Cindy, like the other two, Hoa here on the panel that I just mentioned, one of the things that really struck me about all three of them is that they never work for their own personal recognition or glory, but are so often making space for others to speak. And so I really want to mahalo all the ways that Cindy has tried to open spaces of dialogue for Palestinians and Kanaka Maoli to have meaningful exchange. So mahalo for letting me be a part of this conversation. I'm very honored to be with you all. For myself, just a brief introduction. I consider myself to be a lifetime student of and participation in Hawaiian movements for Ea and Aloha Aina, which we can talk about more, but are poorly translated as sovereignty and love for the land. That work has included, publications, which I won't really talk about because they're in my bio, but has also really involved all these relationships. And so one of the most meaningful to me in the recent years has been the work with 4 activist women elders, including Terry Kiko'olani Raymond, who I mentioned a minute ago, to work on Nawahine Koa, Hawaiian Women for Sovereignty and Demilitarization, to lift up the work that these women who have dedicated the better part of 50 years of their lives with no major recognition and certainly no remuneration for the work that they've done to challenge militarism in Hawaii and beyond, and to build networks and relationships of solidarity with other people, and particularly women and non-binary folks in struggle. So I'm grateful for that work that they've done, and for being able to be in conversation with them, and just at a point in my career where I could open space for them to publish their stories in some form. I only have a few minutes left in the intro, so I think I'll just lay a few of the terms that I was hoping to maybe talk through together with you all on the table, and we can discuss them more. So through the terms that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of my practice as a scholar, activist, friend, comrade, is Transindigenous, which comes from Chadwick Allen's book, Transindigenous Methodologies for Global Native Literary Studies, where he talks about, moving beyond a comparative frame and rather putting in his context multiple Indigenous texts in juxtaposition and see what the crossings from one to another teaches us, rather than just, sort of a comparative approach. And my colleagues and I in Indigenous politics, Noelani Silva, Heoli Osorio, and then previously Hokulani Aikau, have really also tried to use that framework to think about what it means to have trans-Indigenous contexts of scholarly exchange among our students and faculty, colleagues, and not just to build on not just building the requisite expertise that it takes to make those crossings, as Alan talks about, but what does it take to really establish the requisite trust and respect between peoples in different Indigenous contexts, so that those crossings can be made in a good way that are mutually beneficial and not extractive. The second concept that I've been thinking a lot about and trying to really use in my practice is the idea of kuleana, which I can't get into in a minute here, but is poorly translated as rights, responsibility, authority, obligations, but really from a Hawaiian cultural context is fundamentally tied to genealogy and to place, and makes us constantly think about what our rights, responsibility, authority, all of those things are in a given context in relation to where we are and who is there with us. And so for me, this term is a really important one that helps us push beyond kind of the damaging, ways of thinking about the self and individual rights that are based on property and private property within a Western context, where kuleana allows us to think about how our relations and our obligations are layered and complex, much more complex than I think what settler frameworks and language allow us to think about. And then the last term that I'm thinking a lot about lately, particularly in light of the Mauna Kea struggle, is kukulu, which I first began to hear and talk about with Andre Perez, Ikaika Hasi, and Ilima Long when we were forming Mana, a movement for Aloha no Ka'aina, which is not currently active, but we're all active and still in solidarity and relationship with one another. But in any case, that meaning to build, and that was the context that we were really thinking about it in ku'e and kukulu, to resist. What do you resist? What do you build? That it's a term that's also been used by people like Kamana Opono Crab to think about expansively building together and with the different kinds of strengths that people have in restoring Hawaiian nationhood. But then most recently, in terms of Mauna Kea, I've been really interested in the ways that leaders in that movement have been using it in the other valences of the term. So thinking about Auntie Pua Case's use of the term in her Meleka'i Kukulu, and the other ways that this term means pillar or a post, where it's not just one central thing or organization that's needed, but many to sustain a movement or to hold something up. Kukulu is also a term that can mean to tie together, and it can mean to stand together or to stand up for someone, to speak in someone's favor. And so I'm interested in the ways that we could think about Mauna Kea as a kukulu of these larger movements of struggle to protect sacred places, to protect waters, to protect Indigenous connections with place, to challenge transnational capital, as well as to think about how we each as individuals are, connected as kukulu and tied together. So that's my introduction, and mahalo nui.
So let's move to Cindy.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be on this panel with organizers of the panel and participants from whom I've learned so much, and whose acts of solidarity as activists and scholars are just really inspiring to me. When Tuti sent me the invitation to be on this panel, I was really struck by a quotation from Rumi that is part of Tuti's signature line. It says, "Beyond right and wrong, there is a field. I will meet you there." And actually, Ekta, if you can put on the slides, I'll tell you when to change them. Thanks. I've been thinking about this quotation in relation to this panel and the work that I've been doing at the intersections of Palestinian and Hawaiian struggles for liberation. And also as a faculty member at the University of Hawaii and co-founder of Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine at UH. And also as a member of the organizing collective for the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, or US ACBI, and as a settler committed to supporting decolonial movements led by Aloha Aina. At first take, Rumi's words seem better suited for personal relationships than political struggles, where they can seem like a familiar form of liberalism. But I knew I needed to think harder. After all, it was Tuti who was sharing this quotation. And also thanks to her sharing it, I realized that Jen Marlowe had drawn on Rumi, entitling her Palestine play, There Is a Field. And Ekta, if you could do the slide. And so I've been considering how Rumi is speaking to the need to find a space beyond the confines of man-made laws and edicts that regularly legitimate injustice, and about how this formulation invites a way of coming together in love and with imagination to dream up new ways of being, both of which I believe to be at the heart of meaningful solidarity. So the 2010 play, There Is a Field, has in fact been part of my own pathway to forging solidarities. In writing it, Jen Marlowe draws on interviews and archival sources to explore how a Palestinian family journeys through grief after Israeli forces kill their young son, Asil. In March 2016, Marlowe organized a Land Day touring for the play. For Palestinians, Land Day commemorates the 6 Palestinians Israeli police killed on March 30th, 1976, as they were protesting the Israeli government's expropriation of thousands of dunams of Palestinian land. Land Day marks Palestinians' steadfast and ongoing resistance to settler colonialism. That March 30th, SFJP at UH held a reading of There Is a Field that was also a fundraiser for the Land Day touring, followed by discussion and a potluck. This tour and our reading took place during a critical juncture of mobilization for rights of Palestinians and other Indigenous people, Black Palestinian solidarity, and transnational movement building. This was like Standing Rock, and also the year BLM really went global. Those of us who participated, Ekta, I remember you were part of this, discussed ways to strengthen intersectional and global social justice movements. We also prepared for the arrival of Birzeit University students, Noor Douglas and Mai Hassan, who are participating in a Right to Education tour co-sponsored by Birzeit's Right to Education campaign and National Students and Faculty and National Students for Justice in Palestine. Our plans involved a panel featuring them and Angela Davis, whose visit to UH coincided with theirs, and who continued her long-standing support for Palestine by giving much of the event over to them and Tuti. Ekta, if you could do the slide. It also involved an environmental justice bus tour that Candace set up, as well as arranging for carpooling, classroom visits, and hospitality. In other words, our reading of There Is a Field served as an occasion for education, intellectual exchange, political discussion, and organizing. And it was also a way to build on relationships with each other, with Jen Marlowe and her organization Donkey Saddle Projects, and with the students who are about to arrive from Palestine. So in my remaining moments, I want to focus on the significance that such relationships hold for solidarity, especially given the conveniences of online events and the acceleration of the corporatized academy, which means Zoom life is likely to persist well beyond the pandemic. Since 2013, in my work with SFJP at UH, formerly the Hawaii Coalition for Justice in Palestine, and also crucially with the amazing folks who make up Friends of Sabeel Hawaii, I've been committed to bringing Palestinians to Hawaii each year. Many of these visits have taken place as part of what we have come to call Decolonial November. These Decolonial Novembers have featured Yusuf Al-Jamal, Rana Barakat, Ramzi Baroud, Noura Erakat, Noor Judah, Remy Kanazi, Tarek Luthan, Stephen Salida, and Nadra Shalhoub. In addition to organizing lectures at UH and talks at churches, we have held roundtables and poetry readings at the Kamakakuakalani Center for Hawaiian Studies to explore Hawaii and Palestine as intersecting and distinct sites of occupation and settler colonialism. And these events have included Kehalani Kawanui, Ali Musle, Ilima Long, Andre Perez, Mono Day, Joy Inamoto, Kahala Johnson, Mahea Ahia, Noe Goodyear-Kaopua, Punahele, and John Osorio. If you could do the slide, you can see Noe with her little one. Perhaps most importantly, these visits have focused on spending time with Hawaiian and Hawaii-based scholar activists. So in addition to Candace facilitating environmental justice bus tours, Kyle Kajihiro, along with Auntie Terry Keiko Olani, have taken our guests on detours. The Rapoons have hosted them at their farm and sent them home with fruit and honey and chocolate. When Rana Barakat and Yusuf Aljamal came last year, we went to Mauna Kea for a weekend with Kehalani Kawanui, and they taught courses at Pu'uhulu University. And if you could do the slide. Along with Noura Erakat, here for the second time, they also participated in Noontime Protocol at Wise Field and afterwards in a rally for Mauna Kea. During these visits, we've really prioritized time to gather for meals, karaoke, beach trips, and hikes, and to share stories and build friendships. And in this regard, I really want to note the labor of love undertaken by Ali Musle, who is a PhD student in political science and has played a really key role in forging Hawaii-Palestine solidarity. And this has happened not only through his brilliance as a scholar and his artistry in designing flyers for just about every single event we've done, except for the really ugly ones that I did. But also he's just extended extraordinary hospitality in the form of airport rides, meals, and hookah. And if you could do a slide. When Remy Kanazi was here, I remember a Kailua beach walk that Ali and I took with him. We were talking about how to build movements and the difficulties of online organizing, and Remy said, movement building best happens one-on-one or in small groups, not at massive rallies, not at protests or through events featuring famous people. And because we are small in number here in terms of Palestine solidarity work, I took those words to heart. And I want to conclude by considering what I think such exchanges and sharing of stories make possible. Without the friendships and the commitment, care, and trust that they engender, there is no way to work through difficulties when they arise, and they always do arise. There is no space to fuck up or to forgive, to find that field beyond right or wrong. There is no incentive to take risks that are not about ego building, but that are necessary to movement building with care for one's comrades. There is no pleasure, and without pleasure, movements will perish. Such relationships also help ensure accountability and purpose in one's scholarship and awareness of its political impact. And I'm happy when we move to discussion to say more about this in relation to a special issue of biography on life in occupied Palestine that I co-edited, as well as my current book project. Anyway, it's been very moving to me to see over the past several years a strengthening of Hawaii-Palestine solidarity. And the roots for this are really long and deep, but the current blossoming owes to the efforts of many people who are here today. And we're going to see Tuti in this next slide, among others. I want to close with one such manifestation of that solidarity that, as we sheltered in place, built on relationships forged through travel and time spent together. And this is, Candace referenced this. So last October, US ACBI organized a National Day of Action in response to Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube having censored Rabab Al-Duhadi and Tomomi Kinukawa's open classroom at SFSU, featuring Layla Khaled and other freedom fighters. So when SFJP at UH and COA Futures at Kyle Kajihiro's initiative organized a webinar, We Will Not Be Silenced, the case of Khaled and solidarity from Hawaii to Palestine, which thanks to Noe Political Science immediately co-sponsored and also ethnic studies, Zoom shut that event down too, with complicity from the UH administration, who declined to provide us with another site, and who also ignored a letter from Palestine Legal Organization challenging the constitutionality of the censorship. At the brilliant suggestion of Kalikoa Ka'eo, students and faculty then organized a reading on Zoom of Khaled's words read by tenured faculty, and that included Noe and Candace. And then we could have the next slide. This willingness to act in the face of administrative chill and Zionist harassment, including in the form of FOIAs, came out not only of political conviction, but friendships and ongoing conversations with our Palestinian comrades that have taken place in classrooms and lecture halls, but also at dinner tables and on sand and in water. So we can have the next slide. Solidarity is not a sentiment, but a practice, one that involves being educated and willing to learn and listen deeply. And though I've given it short shrift here, when it comes to Palestine, to be a scholar requires also being an activist, given the censoring and criminalization of all that is Palestinian. And to be an activist requires to be a scholar, because you cannot work for Palestine without doing your homework. In addition to intellectual work, solidarity requires unglamorous behind-the-scenes labor, doing whatever would be today's equivalent of licking envelopes. I think it also means knowing when to speak out and when to shut up, and going beyond one's place of comfort with care and humility. It involves trust that happens best not as a leap, but as a foundation built by having a history of showing up for each other and knowing each other's histories in ways that are at once personal and political. Solidarity goes beyond analogies and transactions and beyond, though it certainly must include shared and interconnected political objectives and beliefs. In short, I want to just close by saying that for me, solidarity is a practice of decolonial love, and it is nice to be sharing this space for those who have taught me so much about that. So thank you. And I'm going to turn things over now to Kyle.
Hello, Kako. Thank you to the organizers and to my co-panelists. This is such a great conversation. It's been a really rough few weeks, so this is giving me a lot of energy and hope. So thank you for that. I'm Kyle Kajihiro, speaking to you from US-occupied Hawaii in the Ahupua of Waikiki in the ili of Mo'iliili. I am a settler of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii. I want to thank Tuti for the invitation to reflect on solidarity. And I realized sort of what Candace was saying about solidarity being an embodied practice. The only way I could talk about it is to sort of trace my sort of meandering political journey a little bit, and where solidarity came into my own consciousness and my own practice. So forgive me if it's a little bit of a wandering, but hopefully I can extract some lessons from this. So I guess one of the pivotal moments in my own political awakening was when I was living in Portland. I went to college up there, and this is during the Reagan years. So it was a time of reactionary politics, and the U.S. was conducting its dirty wars in Central America. The Portlander Benjamin Linder was killed by Contra rebels doing work in Nicaragua. And it kind of was I guess it brought it home for me living in Portland at that time. And it made me reflect on the dirty wars and the regime change that the US had done to Hawaii. And why didn't I know more about that? And why wasn't that, how do we build, a solidarity movement around that? So through Central America, I had a kind of particular perspective on Hawaii's history. I became active in some pro-Hawaiian sovereignty work. At that time, Kalahui Hawaii was one of the groups that was quite active. And so we formed networks in the continent to do solidarity with actions in Hawaii. And there were groups in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Las Vegas, and a little bit in Virginia. And I guess one of the things, lessons from this episode was that, empire was a global problem, and that we needed to tackle that on a much larger scale than just the local. Also, that the diasporic communities were really a strategic base to organize, and that could make an impact. So that was something I got. Well, one of my friends turned me on to Paulo Freire around this time, and it helped me to also reflect on a problem I was wrestling with, is why Japanese in Hawaii who had experienced racism, discrimination, exploitation, turned our backs on that history of struggle and aligned ourselves with the structures of the settler colonial state. And so there was some analysis in there that was helped me to unpack that, and how even the oppressed can align our interests and our perspectives with the oppressor. Um, Another sort of moment, I guess, for me was in 1989. The neo-Nazi skinheads killed Mulugeta Sarah, who was an Ethiopian student in Portland. And the neo-Nazis were trying to make Portland into a white supremacist state, or not just Portland, but the whole Pacific Northwest. And so I'm getting sort of flashbacks with the politics that are happening right now in the US. I'm flashing back to this moment of sort of terror and anxiety, and the sense of urgency that we had to band together. And Portland being a very white city, the people of color there, we felt this need to band together. So the lesson out of this episode was the necessity of solidarity. That it wasn't something that you do as an afterthought, or um, a luxury, but it was a necessity, that our work had to be always in solidarity. And around the same time, there was a right-wing Christian resurgence in the Pacific Northwest. Christian groups were trying to pass a constitutional amendment to basically make homosexuality illegal at a constitutional level. And so I got involved in organizing against that, and we were successful in defeating it. But it also showed where the opponents, our enemies, will attack what they perceive to be the weakest links. And we really had to work hard at doing education within Asian American communities, within the Black communities, Latino communities. And it was really hard work, because we had to convey the sense that, this attack against this group might not be you, but it could be you in the future, right? And so so not to make it all about self protection or self-interest, but that there was a way that the standing up for others was also standing up for yourself, and we had to sort of weave that into our politics. So something about how solidarity came into my consciousness, I guess, is that realizing my own vulnerabilities was a part of it. That as privileged as I felt, as protected as I felt, growing up as Asian in Hawaii, where I wasn't subjected to the kind of intense anti-Asian racism, I was still vulnerable to white supremacy, violence, colonialism. There was also organizing led by indigenous peoples in resisting the 500 years of Columbus in 1992, the Columbus Quincentennial. And so that was an opportunity for us to start building sort of a broad base of decolonial solidarities among various peoples of color. But it was also hard, because as we were trying to forge this unity, all the particularities of our history all came into the fore. And so as we were just trying to make this one, I worked with some artists to do a mural project representing, expressing 500 years of resistance from our various cultures and traditions, getting some agreement about like what should be in it and how they link together was really difficult. And so I guess there's always a tension between how to form the common, the united front, and the universal and the commonalities, while not doing violence to the particularities of our experiences and the politics. And then after Portland, I moved back to Hawaii and began working for the American Friends Service Committee, Peace and Social Justice Organization. And one of my areas of work was demilitarization. And this is where I guess I sort of found a place for myself as a settler in Hawaii to do work that helps to dismantle the power that sort of holds the settler state in place. By as some one of the things that would be my kuleana, I felt, is trying to attack that structure and dismantle it as much as possible. So doing work to educate, to find holes and pull it apart, to open up space for indigenous futures and politics to grow, and to take back lands from the military occupation, I felt like was something that I could be doing. And this work also led me to doing more international work. And so a characteristic of the U.S. empire is this archipelagic nature. And something I learned from activists like Soli Niheo, Kekuni Blaisdell, Terry Kiko Olani was that our solidarities also had to have an archipelagic sensibility, that we had to see that these distances and these linkages were not obstacles, but actually they created a network that gave it resiliency and strength to restrain this beast that's devouring all of our lands. And so through groups like the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific and some of the anti-military solidarity networks that we were forging, I learned about the importance of those type of relationships. And so I just want to mention one of the trips I did in 1999 with Terry Kiko Olani was to the island of Vieques, in Puerto Rico, where an anti-basist struggle was kind of at its peak. At that point, activists had occupied the bombing range, and there were so many resonances with the movement to protect Kaho'olawe Island from the Navy that it made sense for us to go there to express our solidarity. And so one of the stories was, going there, Terry insisted that we had to do protocol, right? And so this is something that Tuti, you raised earlier. Is like, how do you go to somebody else's house? How do you announce yourself, your intentions? What do you bring, right, to that relationship? And so, we thought hard about it. What sort of gifts? What kind of political work and cultural work? And so, she said, we should get some pa'akai, some salt, representing Kanaloa, the sea. We should get fresh water, wai, representing Kane, and she got the water from Waikane Spring in the Ko'olau, Poko. We got some tea leaf, la'i, which symbolizing lono, god of abundance and the harvest, and then the chant Iku Mau Mau, invoking the power of ku and sort of politics and struggle. And so we asked our organizer in the bombing range in Vieques, we said, we want to offer this to the land. Is this appropriate in the Catholic country of Puerto Rico? Would this be welcome? And they were totally happy to have us, but we didn't know where to do it. The land was so decimated, but we found one tree, this evergreen native tree, shiny dark green leaves. Its roots were barely hanging on to this eroded soil. And they said, this is a native tree, we could do it there. And so we did our ceremony. Terry, formed a circle, led us through the chants. And as we finished, we heard this sound up in the top of the tree. It was beep, 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 beep. This little bird about the size of a minor bird that had landed right in the peak. And it was, someone said, oh, look, it's a pitire. A pitire is a native bird in the Caribbean that, and there's a saying, an olelo noeau that we encountered many times in our trip. Cada guaraguao tiene su pitire. Every guaraguao, or this sort of a large predatory raptor, has its pitire, and this pitire is so fierce and resistant that they can defeat even the largest guaraguao. So behind me, my virtual background is a pitire chasing away a guaraguao. And this was over, we were going to a hearing for some of the protesters who had been arrested in San Juan, and above us, this drama took place. And so I took it as a sign, as a kind of a ho'ailona that, these solidarities were important, and that every place, we can be inspired by the resistance of the local people against these oppressors. And we need to take courage from that. And we also needed to be examples for others. So I'll end my my sharing there and look forward to the conversation. But thank you.
Great, thank you, Kyle. I guess our time was supposed to be up in an hour at 1:30 Pacific time, but we do have time to spill over. I want to honor. I think a few of us might need to leave our gathering, but for those who can stay online and have a conversation about solidarity and these reflections on solidarity, I welcome us to stay. Great. So do we have reflections or questions for our from our speakers? I think you know, Candace began by reminding us that this is an embodied practice of solidarity, um, and opening it up to reflections from the panelists on that, more on that embodiment of of the solidarity, the practice. And if anyone, if people have questions, please put them in the chat, or you could even raise your hand and we can unmute you to let you ask the question. Okay. Rohan. Okay, I'll just read Rohan's question and response. Thank you for this rich collection of stories and thoughts. I wonder if you could speak to the corporatization of the university and the challenge that poses for solidarity and organizing in the university. So all of our faculty members here, Candace, Noe, Cindy, and then our adjunct, more precarious faculty, Kyle. Candace, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that is a really excellent question, because that corporatization is pitting disciplines and departments against each other. And one of the first programs, like as we're facing these budget cuts because of the pandemic, one of the first things they want to cut is ethnic studies. So the very basis for solidarity in Hawaii, the ethnic studies department, is the first thing they want to cut. And it was just horrifying to see that the struggle that went on 30 years ago continues today, against any kind of diversity. So anyway, it feels like because we're scrambling for resources, we're often being pitted against each other. We used to have a lot of cross-listed courses, but because of budget cuts and because we have very little money and we're dependent on our majors and our students and enrollments in order to fund our courses, things like cross-listed courses are on the cutting block as well. So there are ways in which the corporatization of the university is an attempt to actually sever these solidarities that we've built over the years, cross-disciplinary, cross-racial, cross-class, our community efforts are also, those kinds of things are never funded. But the revolution will not be funded and certainly not by the university. Sorry, that's just, okay, that was just my first take on it. It was like, I'm sorry. And other people can speak to the other parts. People invested in ideology of self-interest. Definitely. How do we teach our students to reach out to others when they're struggling in their daily lives, to pay for college, to stay afloat, to even just feed themselves, right? Like, I mean, we have a food pantry on campus, so we recognize those struggles. But I think that one thing I would just say is that students find that when they join these different organizations like Oceania Rising or the Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine, that they're fed by the solidarity itself, that is what sustains them through these really difficult times, is feeling that they're a part of something larger and that there's larger stakes than their even as they struggle with their everyday, meeting their everyday needs. Anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add quickly that agree with everything Candace said, and talk about a little about why this is such an important time for organizing, and to think particularly in our context about how to support the graduate students who have been organizing. And graduate students are not recognized as workers by the state and have been trying to get the ability to form a union, and have been just doing amazing organizing that's intersectional, that both provides mutual aid for each other, and for graduate students who are in these really precarious positions, particularly during the pandemic when people are even more food insecure, and also working to make the connections between organizing graduate students in a university and the struggle at Mauna Kea, and the ways that protectors of Mauna Kea have challenged the university to live up to its, so-called vision of being a Hawaiian place of learning or an Indigenous serving university. And I think so. Labor, organizing ourselves in that way is so important, and supporting one another, and then using those groups of our unions really to make more expansive or build a more expansive political coalition. And I think our union, the faculty union, is not as good at that because it is a professionalized union. But as all of us here on the panel are, I think, trying to push for ways that can happen.
Mhm. Mhm.
Could I just add to that question about the corporatization? So when I was working in the community setting, I would always feel sort of frustrated that, how come the smart people at the university weren't doing more to help us do research and things like that? And then I jumped over and entered grad school after thinking that I could use some of that academic space to do political work. But now I realize how hard it is. They make you, keeping you precarious, in a precarious situation, running on that treadmill. And it's really hard to do work. It doesn't count. Even when a department like ethnic studies grew out of community struggles, grew out of that symbiosis between community and the academia to create social change. Now that's being pulled apart, and so our service learning programs and all these things are they don't count as much, right? They don't count as real work. So I think that's difficult, but we still find spaces, the undercommons in the university for us to do this work and to have that kind of study that doesn't count but still matters.
Mhm.
I also want to say something about corporatization and bring it back to this this Zoom and YouTube and Facebook censorship, which also the Google platform contributed to as well. And just say when these corporations have so much say over the university, that it was kind of distressing that people who, I feel like everyone should be upset when these three giant entities can come together and basically dictate what can and cannot be said in a classroom. And the university does not care about this. Or if they do care, it's because there are pressures from donors who don't like what it is that we might be doing in our classrooms. So I think that this kind of this is where the need for solidarity really comes in, that we have to take these kinds of censorings and silencings very seriously wherever they occur. And I think this is tied to the attack on tenure that's happening and the adjunctification of the university in terms of faculty and of staff. That freedom of speech is under attack, and that kind of erosion of faculty rights is all part of, I think, corporate pressures on the university. And so that I feel like we really need to be tuned in and standing up for each other whenever these attacks occur. And also, I just really appreciated the attention to language that my fellow panelists have given. And one of the things that I find completely disgusting is the way university administrators appropriate movement language and then use it in a way that is actually to disempower people. And so one of the things I've been kind of thinking about are ways to try and hold people to that language. And I want to just quickly reference Tai Tengan in ethnic studies, who is so brilliant at that. And I remember we were at a meeting with administrators who were threatening to take away the money from American Quarterly after the American Studies Association passed its boycott of academic institutions resolution. And the administrator started talking about our kuleana, and I just said, I'm so happy you're talking about kuleana, because it is our kuleana as Kanaka to stand with our Hawaiian brothers and sisters. So we will respond strongly to whatever you do about this journal. And it was just such a kind of powerful turning of that language back against administrators who are attempting to appropriate it. So that's a whole array of thoughts there that they were just kind of triggered by this issue of corporatization, which I think is so serious right now.
Mm-hmm. And a couple of other comments that have come in. One that asks, are there special challenges in being in solidarity with the poor? And then another from Cynthia, in here in Brazil, we live a difficult moment. We live a difficult moment where people do not value science, and researchers don't have support to follow this path. The university somehow can appeal to the public and social movements. How can we connect both and make people understand the university as a space to grow community? And then from Sherry, who asks about love being a part of building solidarity. I guess that's the broad scope of our questions from our participants. But to leave it, ask any of the speakers if you want to have any comments or reflections on this. Let's see. Cynthia.
Oh, I was just going to say, if Noe has something to say, since she has to leave so soon, she should go first.
Thank you. There's so many questions here that we could possibly take up, and someone also just pointed back to AJ's question about, do you think we ought to work on these people instead change the system within which such cynicism is bred? So I'm not even sure where exactly to start, except to say that I think, and hopefully this will come back to some of the questions, but I definitely agree with what Cynthia had said about the need to build the friendships, that some of this stuff has to happen at the beach over food, not in meetings or in Zoom meetings. And that I agree with what, she had quoted Remy Kanazi as saying that, it really starts on this very small scale kind of level of building friendships at the individual and sort of that sort of level. But I also am thinking about the power that ceremony and ritual has had in the Mauna Kea movement in providing a space to bring people together and to reorient everyone. In that case with the aha that took place literally 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, to what is a common purpose that we all have. And so I don't have the answer here, but I have been trying to think about how we can incorporate ritual and ceremony in a non-oppressive kind of a way, and a very expansive and inclusive way, to make space for people of all different kinds of belief systems, but yet to kind of renew our commitment to one another, to the relationships. And as Tuti and others kind of opened, as Tuti opened us, and then others have reiterated, that the importance of protocols in so many Indigenous cultures is, it's holding a space for us to renew and appreciate the relationships that we have with one another, and to deepen and to strengthen them. And the more that we can remind ourselves how connected we are, then the answers kind of emerge organically out of our relationships. And I'm not quite sure how to do that in a university space all the time. But certainly in community spaces, we have so many great examples, like the ones that Tuti opened us with. So that's kind of what I wanted to put out there.
Mm.
Um, I just want to support what Noe just said, and I think that the question about love, I think that that is the kind of the glue that's holds relationships together, and that they have to be tended to. Ceremony and these kinds of protocols are ways of structuring that process. So I'm also refer back to Tuti's work with Ho'olu Aina and the kind of circle that they create, where it's acknowledging and enacting the relationships. Relationships don't just exist; relationships have to be enacted. And so, by doing those things purposefully, intentionally, and investing it with that kind of love, I think it changes people, and it also it has a disciplining effect on our relationships. It creates certain structures and expectations, responsibilities, as well as that relationship, which I think is important. Um, in terms of like people who, how do you work with folks who don't share, these values of solidarity? Maybe not everyone is at the right place at, right now to have that conversation, but they might be. And this is where I think Kuleana is a kind of a dynamic and shifting set of relationships. It's situational. It's like when, where, how, with who. The relationship might change. And so there might be times when it does open up a space to have that kind of a conversation and to draw someone into a different kind of relationship, to a more liberatory politics. Um, and there might be those that are not reachable, at least not in my lifetime. But I think we have to allow for that as well. But if we can create these spaces to invite more people in, to that kind of a circle, I think we stand a better chance.
I noticed that Monisha has her hand up. Do you have a question or a response?
Um, Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts about movement building and solidarity. It was really wonderful to hear all of you and see all of you, even if it is by Zoom. I just wanted to say a little bit about the earlier questions about corporatization and building alliances with the poor. When the attack on ethnic studies happened, with the pandemic-induced sort of budgetary pressures, I think one of the things that really struck me is how quickly we organized. We were already prepared, and we as faculty know how to build movements because of that. Because of that culture that we built in our department, where we expect our faculty to step up, organize, bring in all our allies in the community, and to keep that constant work of building those relationships with the community. So we came out of the community and we've never forgotten it. We constantly are back to the community. I think the question about building alliances with the poor is something that we are faced with as faculty, as we are trying to really put pressure on the fact that we are workers too. And we share many of those struggles that other workers also face, whether it is the contingency, whether it is our workload, whether it is the disrespect with which our work is met. So my call to faculty is to really start to think of ourselves as workers. Only then will we be able to see those commonalities with other working people, other poor people, people who are not working. So those are kind of my thoughts, just, again, in humility and, amazement at the people who shared today.
Well, thank you. And um, any other responses from our Candace? It looks like you're unmiked. Are you ready to add some comments?
I wanted to respond. I thought Cynthia and Sherry's questions actually go together. So the struggle against to protect Mauna Kea, it is a struggle of love. People have chosen to explained to the public and the media that they are protectors and not protesters. They are standing for Mauna Kea. It is not a stand against the TMT, it's a stand for Mauna Kea. And part of the problem is I do believe there are Kanaka Maoli scientists who are doing incredibly important decolonial STEM work And I think their work is really important in teaching us how to approach climate change, because Kanaka Maoli scientists are looking at the Mo'olelo and Olelo Hawai'i, and they're looking at clues as to how kupuna dealt with climate change events in the past. And so there is a way in which science is respected, but the problem with the TMT building that telescope on the Mauna is that those scientists have not respected Kanaka Maoli knowledges. They propose to put it's considered a conservation district because it is where the water is all in the Mauna, and the TMT proposal is to put two 5,000-gallon tanks buried underground, one for chemical wastewater and one for human wastewater. That's actually 17 or 18 tons each. And so the possibility of a toxic spill is incredible, and it contaminating the water source is amazingly like dangerous, right? So the kupuna, as a sign of love, the kupuna were on the front line. So the elders were on the very front lines protecting the Mauna on July 15th, 2019. And it was strategic. It's a nonviolent direct action movement. The kupuna were on the front lines. They're in wheelchairs. They were bundled up in their chairs. When they were later arrested, their hands were zip tied. They were carried to the paddy wagons. They were wheeled in their wheelchairs to the paddy wagons. I think that resonated globally with land defenders all over the world who are protecting lands. And to have the kupuna be there out of their love for the Mauna and for their descendants, I think that was also a very powerful way of mobilizing support for the Mauna. So I think love is so important. It is key to Aloha Aina, to Kapu Aloha, and that is what mobilizes us, is to stand in protection of lands and waters.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Candace. And I think, unfortunately, our time is coming to an end. I want to thank all of our speakers on behalf of GDS and the Solidarity Committee. Your generous contribution, I think, helps move our understanding of solidarity forward. And as we said, this is going to be a part of hopefully a collection of reflections on solidarity and helping us build a knowledge base for building solidarity. So thank you for your time and for your work modeling futures of abundance and genuine security. So with that, I guess we will see you all down the road.